One. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. And this is a very special privilege for me, actually, because Jenny, who I've known for quite some years now, is with her mum, Jean, and we're going to have a ValuesJam together. So welcome. And to start with, would you like to introduce yourselves?
I am Jean Hendricksen, mother of Jenny Haase, and I live in Draper, Utah.
And you're
Love
how
it.
old? Pardon? And you're how old?
And I am how old? I am old. But women don't tell their ages.
Quite right too. Quite right too.
Okay.
And could you maybe just give people a flavor of some of the things that you've done in your life without taking up the whole hour, but maybe identify one or two things, because I think you came over from Sweden or something in your heritage and then were involved in art.
Well, I have very fond feelings for my grandparents and my great-grandparents. They came to America because of special needs they had. My grandfather lived in Finland. He was born in Finland. And before World War I, he was getting very, very cautious about Russia. And they were infringing on Finland's territory. So when he turned 18, he left and came to America.
Wow. Doesn't the world go round in circles, eh?
Pardon?
I was just saying the
Yeah.
the world goes round in circles because there are probably people in that country now having not dissimilar feelings.
Yeah.
Hmm. And Jenny, what about you?
Well, born and raised here in Draper, Utah, in the U.S., and uh, delighted to be here with my mom. She is, as you know, Alan, one of my bright, shining examples for my passion project of kindness from the heart, and looking at what does it look like to create a legacy of kindness, which my mom is doing every day, and my dad, who's gone now, but did every day of his life too. So wanting to help amplify more kindness in our world, and whether it's in communities or families or our politics, our industries, our organizations, we're definitely much in need of that.
For sure. And Jenny, I know you're a fan of an occasional pun. And when you were describing your mum and your dad, I couldn't help but think it's in the genes, but I wouldn't say something like that.
No, and not that you just did. Yeah.
So let's choose a card for us. And so, Jean, these are all the cards in the deck, and I'm gonna shuffle them a bit. And while I do that, could you think how many piles you would like me to make in front of me?
Three.
Three. Okay, they're different sizes. And now, Jenny, pile one is on my left and pile three is on my right. So which number pile would you like?
Whichever one has the kindness card in it.
Well, there's not one on top, so we can't do that.
Okay. Um, let's go with the one on your left.
On my left. Okay, well, that's the biggest pile. So now we've got 3, 6, 9, 10, 13, 16, 19, 22, 27, 27 cards. So, Jean, a number between 1 and 27.
15.
15. Thanks a lot. Right in the middle of the deck. Well, we're not too far away from kindness because you two have chosen generosity. And so the first question is this: what does generosity mean?
It means giving your all to help others.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Jenny?
I would say that not necessarily does it mean this, but what it takes is, I think, having an outlook or a point of view coming from a place of abundance rather than scarcity,
Mm-hmm.
and looking at ways that we can, being aware of others' needs, thinking about what we can do to be of service, what skills do we have that maybe will be beneficiary for others. And with that abundance mentality, remembering that, we're not going to become depleted by being generous of ourselves, of our time, and of our energies and compassion, and that it actually can help to give back to us and enrich our lives. That's the abundance kind of part of it.
And then there's something about when somebody's generous, it's kind of that they're actually making a choice to give more than they need, or that they might be expected to give, right? So, what's an example? If there's a homeless person in the street and they're asking for some money, many people might give a small amount of money, and then a generous person might choose to give something a bit more, which they needn't do, but they make that conscious choice to give more than is expected or needed. So there's something about beyond with generosity, I think. And Jean, when you think of the word generosity, so this next part of the question is kind of tapping into your creative thinking. So when you hear the word generosity, what images come to mind? What sounds come to mind? And what feelings come to mind?
I am thinking of teachers I have had in the past who have been more than kind, who have built my self-confidence to the point where I have been able to do some pretty spectacular things.
How did those teachers show their generosity?
Well, one of them, as a habit, she kept me in a few minutes after class. I had her for my last class of the day, and she would talk to me about what she could see in me.
I mean, that's a great example because that teacher probably had a home to go to,
Yeah,
her own life,
yeah.
but she made the decision to spend a few minutes with this student and look at the effect that that's had. That's the other thing about something about teaching. My eldest daughter is an English teacher, and there's a quote, I can't remember who it's by, but there's a quote about teaching, which is teachers touch the future, which I think sums it up. It's just a beautiful quote. What about Jenny? What about so when you think of generosity, what sounds do you think of, or what feelings do you come to mind?
I would think a feeling of joy. Excuse me, feeling of warmth, and I think things that bring a smile in thinking about if you've been generous with someone, or if someone has been generous with you, thinking about the way that it impacts you, the way that that kind of ripples out, making you feel important, cared about, seen. And, there just is that feeling of, if you go a little bit above and beyond. And I think you can be generous without going above and beyond, because you could, the example that you had of, of a homeless person that was asking for something, you could simply not give anything.
Yeah.
And giving anything, and what they're asking for is absolutely generous.
Mm-hmm.
But that feeling of going just a little bit further, I think, just, that feeling of joy.
Mm.
And then, and when someone is generous with you, that also can help to bring especially if it's a very difficult time, a feeling of hope. And maybe where you might not have had hope, or in being generous with someone else, you can help to give somebody else hope. And you mentioned about the teachers touching the future. So it may not be exactly the question here about the feeling, but I wanted to share an example with you that, so my mom was a school teacher for 34 years. And one of the memories I have of her, I mean, she always went above and beyond in the classroom and did the extra and spent the extra time in her own, as so many teachers do here, at least I know in the US, having to spend a lot of extra time and sometimes their own money in school supplies and things like that. But I remember when I was in college, and my mom was teaching fourth grade, and she had a student whose family life was in a difficult situation. His mom and dad were recently divorced. His mom was overwhelmed with working full time, taking care of the three kids. And this young boy was falling behind in his studies. And so my mom went above and beyond and invited him to stay at our home in the summer. And so his mom would bring him on Sunday nights. She would work during the week and then come pick him up on Friday night after work. And then my mom helped to tutor him to help keep him from not only falling further behind, but getting caught up by the next year. So, the generosity of that has stood with me for a lot of years. And I often wonder the ultimate impact it had, on this young boy, and with his mom and with his family. And so that feeling of hope and touching the future through a little bit of generosity is pretty amazing.
Mm. And Jean, do you remember that student?
Mm-hmm. In fact, he came to see me years and years later. He came to see me, and he remembered the help that he got.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about that situation where for the student and his mum, they probably thought that, and I'm guessing now, right? So please correct me if this isn't accurate, but they were probably thinking, oh, Jean, that's so generous for you to invite him to stay for the summer in your house. But probably to you, it just felt like a normal thing to do, because sometimes the person that is generous, actually for them, it's not a big deal. It's just like I just want to do this. And yet the person on the receiving end is often, it means so much more to them. And so I guess the point that I'm working towards is that sometimes there's a disconnect between the perception of the value between the person that is giving and the person that is receiving. So what are your thoughts on that, both of you?
I am speechless.
Maybe you could teach Jenny.
Yeah, I was waiting for something like that, Alan. Do you want to think a moment?
Okay. Repeat your question.
So I'm thinking about in a situation where one person is being generous to another person,
Mhm.
the person who receives often thinks it's something bigger than the person who is giving. There seems to be a different perception somehow, or maybe that's not right. Maybe that's not your experience.
To me, it was just a normal kind of thing. It was no big deal.
Yeah. And what about other examples, Jenny? I mean, I'm sure you can think of loads of examples of generosity, but what are your thoughts on this different level of perception?
Um, I think part of that different level of perception might be that the person that is being generous um, doesn't necessarily know the situation that the other person is in.
Hmm.
So, they may be thinking, you have no idea how much I needed this right now
Hmm.
because we don't know what's going on in somebody's lives, right? And then we also don't know, just like we've talked many times about with kindness, the ripple impact. So at the time, we have no idea what it's going to mean to somebody. And we just know that we might be generous or kind or compassionate or whatever. And then over time, that individual that was the recipient, if they're really being aware, may think about, oh, that was a turning point for me.
Yeah.
And look what's happened since then. And it changed my attitude, changed the way that I look at the world, changed the way that I treat other people, changes even, could even change the way that, somebody parents their children or, behaves at work because they were given an extra chance, or somebody was generous with them. So the giver may never have any idea, and hopefully that the receiver, is aware enough to think about, what that really meant, and then how's that changed their lives and impacted them.
Mm. And that's a great way of putting it because it seems to me that that's a really good reason to be generous because actually the impact of your generosity could be 10 or 100 times what you think it's actually going to be.
Yeah.
So, like with jeans, that summer might have changed the direction of that person's life. Okay. So
And
let's
I'd
get.
always wanted a little brother, and so that was the easy way of giving me a little brother for a summer. So,
Well, how old was he?
he was in fourth grade,
Okay.
and I was in college. Yeah. So,
Right. So let's get practical now. And we're going to go to the other side of the coin of generosity. So, for both of you, can you think of a time where you have noticed a lack of generosity?
Now, I am surrounded by people who are just generous, so that doesn't come into my life.
Lucky lady. What about you, Jenny?
well, I was thinking, if you're asking about times when I didn't feel generous, it might be like for the last brownie. Or the bigger or the smaller piece of cake, or something like that, where I might have a real pull at my generosity. And sometimes the good doesn't always win over. Um,
And it doesn't have to be about you. It could be, a situation that you've noticed in society with people that are close to you, something that you've read in the news. It can be anything.
well, then I would say, there's a lot of um, scarcity mentality taking place. There's a lot of us and them. There's a lot of, well, I'll be generous as long as so and so thinks like me, or I can agree with them, or, they're in my same camp, or they're in my same political party, or just whatever that is. So unfortunately, there's a lot of that. And um, And in a lot of ways, I think it's getting easier and easier to, with the polarization that we have going on in so many places around the world, and speaking from our experience here in the US, it can get to be more and more difficult sometimes to keep an open mind and be generous with your heart and be compassionate for, humankind as opposed to my kind.
Yeah.
It's in those two. Um,
And there's also when you talked about people being generous so that there would be a positive response. So there's something about generosity in its purest sense about no strings, right? So
mhm.
it's not because I expect you to do this. And Jean, I'm curious because you've lived a long life, and I have the perception that perhaps 50 years ago, generosity was more pure, whereas today, perhaps generosity is sometimes tainted by people thinking, oh, what am I going to get if I'm generous in this situation? But that might be rose-tinted glasses. So, have you noticed any change in generosity over the decades?
Mm. I think back to childhood when things were very, very unstable. Hitler was coming into power, and sometimes we were less generous in our thinking if someone happened to be of German lineage, because it reflected back.
So maybe that's what Jenny's talking about happening again at this time, because when people have this scarcity mentality and they're kind of in survival mode, that's when it's easier to bunker down and just look after your own and not bother about anybody else, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
And, about the survival mode, when you really do start feeling like, and there may very well be genuine legitimacy to people feeling like, there's not enough to go around. Whether it's rising prices and whatever, or it's just whatever it is, it's easy. Like, well, you think about when COVID hit. And, I don't know how it was in England, but store shelves, you couldn't find toilet paper. You couldn't,
Yeah.
it's just remarkable. And I remember being at our local grocery store and having an amazing conversation with a complete stranger as he's on one end of the long aisle and just looking at these empty shelves, and I'm on the other end. And we're both taking pictures and going, what is this all about? Um, and the fear that came with all of that. Um, and so it's very easy to understand it, but in hoarding, that's not going to be the difference. You may be the one that's at some point in time, if you're saving everything, and then when you're out and you're not willing to be generous with what you have, you might be just completely left alone because nobody wants to, maybe be generous with you.
Mm.
So kind of what goes around comes around, kind of a thing.
And there's also something generally about, so what you just talked about there, about, the your mentality and the environment that you're in to a certain extent and to a large extent determines your response. And so there's a responsibility on the people that lead society to create an environment where people don't feel as though they're not going to get enough to eat or not get this or not get that, so that they can be naturally kind rather than having to be scared of them not being able to survive. Um, there's another quote by couple of guys who wrote a book, and what they said is that culture is determined by the worst behavior accepted by leadership. And I think the same is true of society, where society is determined by the way that leaders allow the most vulnerable people to live. If you're just going to have a survival of the fittest mentality, it's not going to encourage generosity and kindness, is it?
Yeah, and you think about the way that you feel about somebody. So they're, the people that are the most well off, that are not generous at all, that continue just to want more and more and more and take more and hoard and at the expense of others. And you think, gosh, even if I had that ability, I hope that I would not be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you think of others who do give generously, that have the means, but it doesn't necessarily hurt in any way, doesn't really take from them because there's such an abundance, and that's wonderful that people will do that. But the people that really can amaze me are those who have so little to give and still give.
Yeah. And that's true all over the world. There are stories that have been shared with me quite recently about people that are traveling in places in the world where people don't have very much, but they will give to a stranger before they will eat the food themselves. And there's got to be a lesson there somewhere for us, because if it can be done by people with so little, why is it so difficult for people that have so much more? So let's turn the coin onto the positive side then. And so let's hear from both of you about when you have experienced generosity. And I know we've heard about Jean's teacher, but when you think about a generous person, who comes to mind? And is there a specific memory that you have that really encapsulates that generosity?
I think back to the starting of Draper Visual Arts Foundation. And I think about a teacher who lived along the same street where I lived. And she was the one who approached me one time and said, "Jean, we have these beautiful, beautiful paintings that the principal had started helping the children to collect." He was from an art center in Utah. And when he came to be principal of this old school in Draper, he asked the children to give their pennies, their nickels, their dimes. And he would send students to an art center to choose a painting each year. And that painting grew in numbers. We have an original painting by Norman Rockwell, Ichabod Crane, and it is worth now millions of dollars. But the children enjoyed giving their money. They enjoyed the experience of choosing. And later, as I was teaching school, the teacher who was a first-year teacher in 1926 came to me and she said, "These paintings are not being cared for like they should be. There was chipping of paint. there was discoloration because of the fumes from the furnace that warmed the school. So she said, what can we do about it? We went to the head of the school district and we said, we're worried about the paintings because they're not being cared for. What can you do to help? And he said, your cause is just, that we don't have the money. So we started a foundation where people gave to help to restore the paintings. And now we're trying to find a way to build a building to house all of this treasure. And we're hoping that people will be generous and say, yes, I will give to have this building.
Yeah, and how can people do that? I mean, we don't normally do this on a Values Jam. This is the first time, but why not? Why not?
Well, we're a foundation, so it would help them tax-wise, you know.
In the US.
So Jenny, how can people, if there's somebody listening or viewing this now and they're, crazy about art and they've heard this wonderful story and they want to support the foundation, how would they get in touch?
Through drapervisualartsfoundation.org.
Say it one more time.
drapervisualartsfoundation.org.
Okay.
And
or they can get in touch with me.
but you're not going to put your phone number on this.
And Jean, you mentioned, I think I remember you mentioned 1926. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the significance of that date? Was that the beginning of the foundation?
Oh, no. That
Right.
was the beginning of creating the
art collection.
Right. Okay.
We didn't start the foundation until years later when it became evident that things were happening to the paintings that we didn't want to have happen.
Okay. So 1926, was that the beginning of the art collection?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So next year it's 100-year celebration, right?
Yes.
Sure, we haven't thought about that. See the way Alan's mind works.
So we need to have a big celebration.
We do.
Yeah, of course we do.
You are invited to come.
Thank you. Okay.
We can't pay your way, but we would welcome you. And I have a guest room down in the basement.
In the basement?
There's one upstairs too. You'd have to work up to that one. Depending
So
on how generous she's feeling.
now, between the two, I've never done this before either, because in Values Jam, the guest has the opportunity to create their own question about generosity. So between the two of you, I'd like you to just have a quick chat and come up with a question about generosity, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how. So what's something that you're curious about generosity for the three of us to explore?
I have a suggestion.
Yes, give it.
Okay, is that all right? Are you going to think I'm talking too much? My thought is, okay, so I don't think I'm just speaking for the US, but I think there are a lot of difficult times around the world that many people are experiencing. And I think it's a very natural kind of thought process to, self-protection, self-preservation, worrying about your family and keeping them safe and, making sure that your circle is okay. So in a time where it would be easy to see things with a scarcity mentality, what questions can we ask ourselves? What can we do to open ourselves to being more generous? looking at things through more of an abundance mentality, and whether it's thinking about what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to show up? But what is it that we can do during a time that can be a really difficult time to up our generosity skills and abilities and desire to be more of a generous person?
So, do you want to paraphrase that into a succinct question? And maybe Jean can have a go at answering, or else I can, and then you can fill in your thoughts. So, just translating what you were saying, I think it's something like, in troubled times like we've got around the world at the moment, what can we do to encourage people to be more generous and less selfish?
Yes, and I want to make sure that encouraging people is, we're talking about not just encouraging others, but looking for that within ourselves as well.
Yeah. Okay. So, Jean, any initial thoughts on that?
Again, I'm speechless.
I'm thinking that it's something to do with remembering that you're probably in a better situation than many other people. That's one thing.
Mhm.
And then another thing is that I tend to think of us, me, us, as not being separate. We're just part of everybody else. And so why would you stop being generous?
Mhm.
You're just part of. So those are two thoughts that came to my mind initially. When you were thinking about the question, Jenny, what sort of thoughts were going through your mind?
Well, I think another thing is, well, one that I mentioned, it's like, okay, how do I want to be thought of? I want others to see me? How do I want to be remembered? And what kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to see myself? Um, and I think compassionate awareness is a big part of it too. So it's so easy to be just caught up in our own lives and in our own world without really looking around and seeing others and seeing where the needs are. And just, whether it's passing by somebody that is, needing help on the street, or, seeing somebody that is looking really discouraged or is overwhelmed and could use a hand. I mean, it's, whatever it is, if we're not looking around and looking outside ourselves to see what opportunities there are for generosity and kindness and compassion and all of those things, then they may just go right past us without being aware whatsoever. So that awareness, I think, is really important.
Hmm. And actually, this is a bit of a strange thought, perhaps, but I think in a way, being generous is just as selfish as just looking after yourself. Because when you are generous, it feels so good. You just even small things.
Yeah.
So I the other day, so I'm in the what do you call it? What do you call the supermarket? You don't call it that, do you? Grocery store.
Grocery store, supermarket, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, and what I normally do is look behind me to see if the person has got very much in their basket or whatever. And if it's not very much, I usually ask them if they want to go in front. But it wasn't this week, but last week I did that. And so this lady went through, and then an elderly gentleman arrived with his small basket. And so I was like, oh, I've just let her through. He's going to feel as though I'm being really unkind to him if I don't do the same. So in the end, I let three people through. And the third person said, you're going to be here all day. But each of them, you could tell that they were just really pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
And, I know it's not very much, but that joy on their face just meant a lot. And I do it. And now the other thing actually is the more you practice, the more natural it becomes. So maybe there's something in that, Jenny, about even if it doesn't feel very natural, still practice generosity, because then it'll encourage you to do more. And
One
Jean,
of my, I
what's
was just going to say one thing, another thing to add to that is, as a parent, in teaching, you know, so modeling by example, but also teaching, your kids to be generous and to look for ways to be generous. And I just, one example that has stood out for me for years is, probably about 15, 16 years ago. I my family lost this beautiful golden retriever named Delaney. And I was divorced, and just my daughters and I were living at home. I don't think my son was at home at the time. And we had a wonderful family that was in our church congregation that would just check in on us and see how we were doing. Um, and so I let them know about the passing of this beautiful dog, and asked if the dad, if he would be able to help with digging a grave in our backyard for Delaney. And so he comes over and he was helping my brother that's been walking around here. So Adam comes over with all of his children. His wife had a meeting that day, and so they came over, little kids. I mean, anywhere from like 13, 10, 8. There was a little girl that was, I think, 4 years old, and then there was a baby. And even the little girl that was like 4 or 5, whatever she was at the time, so they all have shovels and they're working hard and digging this grave. She has a little tiny trowel, like a little garden trowel. And she gave it, she went and participated too. And I just, not only did that feel incredibly generous, I mean, taking up a whole Saturday for these folks and him bringing his kids over, to the example of him showing about giving of service like that, and to the very littlest one having a chance to participate in it and feel like she was a part of it.
yeah,
About that ripple effect. It was wonderful for my kids and me, and it made a very difficult time, a very sad time, brought some beauty into it with that service. But I just wonder about the ripple effect that those examples of him sharing with his kids, being of service and being generous with your time and physical energy and all of those things. I mean, that I know that's rippled out in extraordinary ways, as his children have grown and are having kids of their own now.
Jenny, as I remember, that family later moved to Georgia.
No, they moved to a different state, but I still see them on Facebook
Yeah.
and different things like that, and you can still see
Yeah.
the services that they're providing
Yeah.
and the generosity and the love that they have for, humanity and their neighbors. And yeah, so being that example to your kids is
yeah.
pretty
And
great way to ripple that impact out.
there's an acronym, I think that's the right word, where the first letter of a series of words spells another word. And it's somebody in the US, I can't remember her name, but she uses the acronym CHILD to stand for Copy How I Live Daily,
Mm.
which is to your point about this guy and his children, right? Because I bet they grew up as really lovely people
Yeah, yeah,
because they were copying him being like that. And
right.
Jenny, I don't think you can take any of the credit for the kind person you are, because you're just copying your mum, right?
And my dad.
And your dad.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up this values jam now. And right at the end, there's always the same question. And that is, what are you both encouraged to do differently about generosity as a result of this conversation?
I just I just think that I can be more generous with my time.
Okay. And do you mind just giving us a little bit more detail about that? What is there something that you have in mind that you might be encouraged to do to be more generous with your time?
I think sitting out on the front porch and encouraging people to just come and sit and talk and share of themselves. And I had my son put some furniture out on the front porch. I occasionally go out and sit, and people taking walks sometimes will stop in and chat and tell of their experiences and their worries and their heartaches. I have a neighbor whose son was a strapping 9-pound, 4-ounce baby,
Gosh.
that now he is so debilitated physically that he can't even manage to have a life of joy. He's in so much pain. But we're able to talk about it. We're able to put things kind of from our hearts.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so well, first, I'm sorry to hear about him, but I'm sure that he takes a lot from being able just to have a conversation. And then I love the idea of the neighborhood being aware that they can just stop and have a chat when they're passing by. That sounds fantastic. What about you, Jenny?
I think it's going to be more of really thinking about, am I being generous? Am I going a little bit above and beyond? So, I mean, I look for ways that I can think about how can I be kind, and I'm looking for opportunities. But there's also ways that you can amp that up a bit and add more generosity into it so that maybe it's not quite as easy. Maybe there's a little edge of it, I don't want to say it hurts a little, but it hurts a little. I mean, it's taking a little bit, um, and having more of that abundance mentality.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I think, yeah, looking for more ways to be generous, whether it's with my time or any other resources,
Yeah.
and then thinking about on a regular basis, kind of doing an audit. How am I doing with that? Do
Okay.
I need to keep up a bit?
So you're going to be the generosity police.
Policing myself, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, not policing others, but
Mine's kind of yeah, it's a bit different to yours because mine really comes from the bit when we were talking about the difference in perception between the receiver and the giver. And so I'm wondering whether I miss opportunities to be a little bit generous because I'm being too hard on myself because I'm saying, oh, well, that's not going to make much difference, so don't bother kind of thing. So I'm going to practice tiny generosity. That's what I'm taking away from this conversation. So thank you both very much for this Values Jam. It's been great to get two inputs from the other side of the screen. And thanks, you're both now, Jenny, you already were a Values Jammer, but now, Jean, you are as well. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.